Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
I'm now going to turn this over to Fiona, and she is kicking us off this morning with the consequences of design session. So,
yeah, and actually there's a word that keeps getting missed on that one, which is what we're focusing on this morning is really the idea of design criticism, and design criticism from people who are maybe outside of the making process and who are a bit outside of the market as well. And the reason I'm interested in that right now really comes down to my role and position at the moment at the Museum of Modern Art. So MoMA, curator of design, director of R&D, and overall force for good, Paolo Antonelli, argues that museums can be considered R&D departments of society as they pursue a slower, more reliable, productive, and constructive progress that incorporates technological and industrial innovation but filters them through a humanistic sieve. So this is a really grand statement for a museum to make, positioning itself alongside the great R&D labs like Bell Labs and whatever else. But I think it's a really interesting proposition. So I'm interested right now in people asking difficult questions about new designs and technologies, and particularly in looking at their impact in the world. So what happens once they get out there? And while there is a discipline of critical design or design fiction, and Julian Bleeker has kindly offered to host a breakout session about that in particular, I'm also interested, as I said, in how we invite and use the criticism of people from outside of that making process, and a potential new role for museums within this. So that's my particular interest. I'm kicking off this morning. I have, so I've lost... I've lost my slides. I just had pictures of my invited speakers, but actually I've taken advantage of this morning to pull in all sorts of other people because I found out I had a little bit more time than I'd suspected when I put it together. So these are my 5 initial invited speakers, but there'll be other people popping up throughout the session, and there'll be some breakout sessions as well. So first up we have Alexandra Lang, and she's really speaking about the critical sensibility. So Alexandra is a New York-based architecture and design critic. Her work has been published by the New York Times and the New Yorker, and she writes a monthly opinion column for online design magazine, Dezeen. I've always thought it would be great fun to have a monthly opinion column. Alexandra argued in her first column for Dezeen that architects need to start thinking of social media as the first draft of history. And that's a quote I'm always using at work when I talk to our curators about the need for them to have much more of a public profile. Alexandra is also the author of The Dot-Com City, Silicon Valley Urbanism, which was published by Strelka Press and is available on Kindle. I urge you to download a copy. Silicon Valley Urbanism considers what the design of the Apple, Google, and Facebook campuses says about the companies we think we know. And Alexandra has long been interested in the creation of domestic life and recently wrote about the Pinterest home for a collection of essays about the quantified home. Alexandra is speaking first today because as the author of Princeton Architectural Press's primer on how to read and write criticism, I thought she could get our consequences of criticism started with a robust definition. So over to you. Thank you, Alexandra.
So, as Fiona just said, I am a design critic. What is a design critic? You may be one already. Here's a test. When you hear about something new, Apple's donut-shaped headquarters, kickstarting floating pools, applying the lessons of Zappos to revitalizing downtown Las Vegas, or Lego for girls, is your first reaction, oh wow, or is it, wait a minute? If the answer is wait a minute, you may be a critic. For the critic, the trick is to turn that minute, that momentary confusion, the narrowing of the eyes, the cocking of the head, into something useful. Because that minute calls up the visual connections, the historical quotes, or the Pinterest pin that may offer a way into explaining what's right or what's wrong about that design. Comparisons are a kind of shorthand, and critics use them all the time. I hope you guys are writing narratives in your head right now for why I would put these two things together. And will continue to do so throughout this presentation before I offer you my own interpretations. So here's one. In June 2011, in one of his last public acts as company chairman, Steve Jobs unveiled Apple's proposed headquarters, a 4-story glass-walled circular building intended to house 12,000 employees. "It's a little like a spaceship landed," Jobs said, and the blurry sun-struck renderings, which I'm sure you've all seen 1,000 times, indeed reminded me of early Steven Spielberg films. But after marveling at the idea of an endless corridor of offices, I realized Apple's donut reminded me of something else. And it wasn't 2011, it was 1971. That was the year that Skidmore, Owings & Merrill completed the Weyerhaeuser headquarters outside Seattle, which you see here on the right. Sure, it's an earthwork rather than a ring, but the concept is strikingly similar. It's a landscape inside and out. When Weyerhaeuser's complex was new, it was the first word in environmental consciousness as company branding. Weyerhaeuser's architect said of the design, "I wanted to find a point where the landscaping and the building simply could not be separated, that they were each a creature of the other and so dependent they could hardly have survived alone." And inside the building, there were no full-height partitions and no private offices. Sound familiar? A relatively newfangled idea from the 1960s known as Bürolandschaft, or office landscape. Unfortunately, Weyerhaeuser is now leaving all of this behind. Apple's building has also been presented with a healthy dose of environmental rhetoric, including Jobs' childhood memories of apricot orchards on the site in Cupertino. Called the greenest building on the planet, the ring is supposed to melt into a newly planted orchard, camouflaged by its own transparency. In both cases, Weyerhaeuser and Apple, the headquarters sites had previous industrial uses, and the construction is presented in a very West Coast way as a healing process, despite the massive amount of energy required to produce these new Edens. Haven't we learned anything from Wall-E? Amazon, Apple, or even a local university could use Weyerhaeuser's historic building to test a more interesting and less heroic theory, that adaptive reuse can be the most futuristic environmental choice of all, even in the suburbs. In the case of the Nest, the design comparison was more obvious. So obvious that I couldn't believe that so few of the articles on the new, round, responsive thermostat went farther back than the click wheel on the first iPod. If you grew up in an old house, the Honeywell Round, seen at Wright and designed by Henry Dreyfuss in 1953, is a thermostat, in the same way that the brown marbleized box of Kleenex is tissues. A hat tip to Dreyfuss wasn't just common courtesy, it was revealing. Dreyfuss's round design couldn't be installed crooked, and the front could be popped off and painted the same color as the living room, as you see in this vintage ad. This was truly home technology designed to age and change. And it's a tribute, I think, to Dreyfuss's good taste that the round wasn't often painted despite the option. The brushed gold that he chose as the base color perfectly blends with most decor. Can the same be said of stainless steel? Dreyfuss also reduced heat control to its essence, clockwise for hotter, counterclockwise for cooler. So Dreyfuss's efforts seem to me like a precursor to on-screen interaction design, which reduces an action to the simplest graphic and the fewest motions. Since the center of the Nest circle is actually an LED screen, there's no need for arrows. Instead, the tick marks light up as you turn. After a week of manual tuning, the Nest is supposed to remember your schedule, which means that after that point, it becomes a glorified motion sensor, rendering the ring obsolete, which I find disappointing, since then there's no actual need for it to be a round object at all. It's often where technology and the home intersect that I feel my mind reaching for a different set of comparisons. Or in the case of the 3D printer, it was reaching for a more precise comparison. Last March, Slate's critic, Seth Stevenson, borrowed a Solidoodle 4, which was then pitched as the accessible and affordable home 3D printer. And he attempted to print a bottle opener from Thingiverse. He ended up, after a series of phone calls and false starts, with what he called a functionless, semi-decorative piece of plastic. So Stevenson concluded from this that 3D printing was no place for amateurs. But then he took a turn toward the larger question of craft. He wrote, "Once upon a time, people purchased sewing patterns, like a program from Thingiverse, and yards of fabric, like filament, and they made their own clothes. I wasn't alive back then, but I'm pretty sure the process sucked." Now, I must be older than Stevenson because I can tell you from my experience, from my mother's experience, from my aunt's experience, and my grandmother's experience that the process of sewing does not suck. And we are not amateurs. Judging from the ease with which one can locate a 30-year-old sewing machine manual, the digital age has not turned sewing into a novelty, but spawned a massive revival. Rather than a cautionary tale, 3D printing can't become a consumer good until it learns a few lessons from why we sew now. 1. What's not on the market? If you have a girl child in America, it is often difficult to find reasonably priced 100% cotton clothing for her without ruffles, pink, purple, butterflies, and hearts. Sewing your own garment will take some time, but then you can have exactly what you want. And in my case, it's not a fruit-colored cube printer. 2, recycling. Say my mother did sew something amateurishly. That's not the end of the story. A misprinted bottle opener is so much trash unless I buy a second machine to remelt my filament. A mis-sewn seam can be ripped out and redone. What are quilts, after all, but a clever way to use every last scrap of precious fabric? The rapid obsolescence of 3D printers also suggests a life cycle closer to that of a mobile phone than that of a washing machine or a 30-year-old sewing machine. 3, sharing. The idea of open source, free, and social media-enabled printing has been built into the 3D printing process. But what does it really teach your children when they can get dollhouse furniture on demand? Except for, except for a desire for ever more instant gratification. When we talk about maker culture, isn't it a better equivalent making things for your dolls out of scrap cardboard, scrap lumber, or indeed fabric? Solidoodle and MakerBot, to become a mass consumer good, need to figure out how to help people who have seen everything in the store and found it wanting, help them on price, help them on style, and help them on durability. Sometimes new design is showy about its comparisons. In 2012, after adding serifs to the Tobias Frere-Jones Gotham font that won him the 2008 election, the Obama campaign rolled out a new set of typefaces along with a new slogan, "Betting on America." This counted as political news for BuzzFeed because America was set in what looked like Revolution Gothic Extra Bold, which the website My Fonts described as inspired by retro propaganda posters and wall painting in Cuba from the 60s to the 80s. A communist typeface. But way more interesting than that to me, than these tenuous Cuban connections, were other subtext in this poster on the right's overall design. That summer, Obama had not gone to Hawaii, but taken a Camp David vacation. He had ridden around the Midwest in a bus. He had eaten at diners. And all of those things were meant to set a specific political message, as did the new Betting on America typography. What it suggested to me was pre-digital, hand-drawn typefaces from early advertising. My first association was, in fact, oranges, the 1920s fruit crate labels, which often combined block letters, scripts, and images of orchards and fields, like the one I showed you at the beginning of this presentation. What could be a better association for a trip to the heartland in the summer? What could be a better callback to the red and white striped fields in Obama's signature O, which you see at the top at left? This was no revolution, Obama was trying to steal Kansas from the man who coded his grandchildren in pink and blue for a Christmas photo by working fonts of the past into his campaign for the future. So Apple, 3D printers, political campaigns, and social media platforms may seem like they come from different universes. On the Pinterest pin, I asked, pincushion or architecture school pinup, and why does it matter? But each of these contemporary elements has ties to a natural and even to a nostalgic world of apples and oranges, orchards, paper patterns, home decor, as well as the digital versions thereof. When you say, wait a minute, in that moment, the cloud of association the brain creates a set of things. Are they apples to apples or apples to oranges? Are they a distraction or a way in? As a critic, I want to take my minute to think about how things have come to be, why they have to be that way, and what their existence means. And sometimes that means blending all the fruit together. Thank you.